right, so we have reached yet another chapter in the disappointing saga of Ben Simmons. He's been all in NBA news over the last couple of days. There was a report that came out that he turned down an offer from the New York Knicks. I'm not 100% sure about the validity of that report, but we did also get some news a few days later that his agent ended up dropping him. So again, his outlook right now as far as his NBA career is extremely confusing. We are at a point where we're not sure whether or not Ben Simmons still even wants to be an NBA player in the first place. And we've been at this point before, right? Like there have been some times in his career where we were extremely uncertain about what things would look like for him as far as his future goes. But I think this is like the lowest of the low as far as Ben Simmons goes. And you can say whatever you want about Ben Simmons, and we can talk about the causes and the reasons behind all of this. One thing you cannot deny and disagree with is that this is possibly the wildest downfall of a former all-star player that we have ever seen in NBA history, right? Especially when we're talking about former number 1 overall draft picks, primarily because Ben Simmons did reach a point where we thought he was going to be a top 5 player, where he was looked at as one of the best players in the league, where he was looked at as one of the 3 best defensive players in the game, where he did have one of the most intriguing offensive upsides we've ever seen in NBA history. The other guys, as far as number 1 overall draft picks who saw this massive downfall in their careers, they never reached the potential or never reached that peak that Ben Simmons reached. So Anthony Bennett, right? You could talk about him being a bust, but there was never a point in time where we thought Anthony Bennett was an all-star caliber player. Same goes for Greg Oden. Maybe there was a short time in his career very early, but he never crossed the 105 game mark in his NBA career. Didn't play over 105 games through his time in the NBA. Kwame Brown as well. There was never a point in Kwame Brown's career where he was an all-star or all-NBA caliber guy. Andrea Bargnani did have a solid start and did end up fizzling out, but again, I'm not sure we ever thought Andrea Bargnani had top 5 level potential through his playing career. Markelle Fultz did have some solid moments and is a bust, but he just ran into so many injuries. He was never even consistently on the court for us to ever look at him as an all-star guy. So all of those guys I mentioned never reached the peak that Ben Simmons reached. Ben Simmons, again, was at a point in time in his career where we thought he was going to be maybe even the best player in the league. There were LeBron comparisons, and I didn't always agree with those. I didn't always see the correlation, but the fact that that was a conversation in the first place shows you just how highly people thought of Ben Simmons. So again, seeing him go from that to where he is now is one of the most disappointing stories in the history of the NBA. Now, there is context for this, right? It's not all 100% his fault. Like, people talk about Ben Simmons as if he's just this inherently lazy player and he just lost his passion for the game. Maybe he did lose his passion and maybe he did lose his hunger. But even with that, there is context and there are reasons behind that. He did suffer a ton of injuries through the course of his career. He started off with a foot injury that kept him out for his first real NBA season, and then after that was consistently running into issues with his back. We all know back issues are very, very tough to recover from, especially for a player who is reliant on athleticism, quite like Ben Simmons. So there is context behind why Ben Simmons was never able to truly recover. He didn't just wake up one day and decide, I don't want to hoop anymore, right? I don't want to play basketball anymore. He did run into a ton of issues from an injury standpoint, and that does alter your work ethic. That does alter how you approach the game of basketball. So there is context to why Ben Simmons is at this spot that he is currently in at this point in time. So again, we can be as mad at Ben Simmons as we want to be mad at him, right? We can sit there and reminisce about his glory days and when he was once an all-star player. But again, there is context behind why his career is at this point that it's at right now. And even with that, right, I will say, while the injuries are a valid excuse and valid context for what's happening and going on right now, what I will say is this. I think my biggest gripe with Ben Simmons is the fact that he never reinvented his game. So sometimes you're no longer going to be able to play at this peak level. You're no longer going to be able to be a number 1 or number 2 or even number 3 priority on the offensive end for your team. Maybe it's because of injuries. Maybe it's because of your playing style, whatever the case may be. The question is, how do you respond to it? And sometimes players have to reinvent their games to kind of make up for some of their issues they're running into. So my biggest gripe with Ben Simmons is he never did that. Again, I get the injuries, but I do think there is a world where you can get injured a lot and you can have those sort of issues. But when you're back on the court, the question becomes, how do you reinvent your game to still be productive to a certain extent? I saw a world where Ben Simmons was a high level Swiss Army knife sort of player. Even if there was going to be a day where he was no longer bringing the ball up court every possession and acting as a primary playmaker, I thought there was going to be a world where Ben Simmons was an amazing utility player, maybe acting as a roll man in the pick and roll and stopping in the short roll and finding guys or making plays in the middle of the court. I never thought he needed to develop a dominant jump shot, but maybe he could have just got like a decent floater in the middle of the lane like guys like Steven Adams have or a few other big men have that just keep them out there on the court. So while the injuries are a valid excuse for what Ben Simmons is currently going through, I do think there was an opportunity for him to adjust his game to still be available and play on the court. He just never fully took advantage of that. There was still a world where 6'9" or 6'10" Ben Simmons could have still been an effective player on a contender, even if he was no longer an all-star or a top priority on offense. He could have played that Draymond Green sort of role. He could have done something very similar to that. He could have been like a higher level Jared Vanderbilt with better passing ability and possibly better defensive upside and better rebounding. There was a world of opportunity for Ben Simmons to reinvent his game to allow him to be playable. And I just felt like he never really tapped into that for a consistent period of time at any point in his career. And I think that's my biggest gripe with him. I get why he's no longer a star player. I get why he's no longer looked at as a future superstar. But my biggest issue is he never found a way to reinvent his game to still be effective on the court. He is almost unplayable. There were some small things Ben Simmons could have gotten better at as far as his offense and everything goes. And also there are examples of guys who were hurt multiple times in their careers and were still able to be effective on the court and etch out a role for themselves. Derrick Rose had multiple lower body injuries and still was able to have a decent playing career. And up until like his last couple of years with the Knicks was still reliable on the court. Kevin Durant is an extreme example, but he's had a ton of lower body injuries and was still able to get out there on the court and produce. So Simmons is not as good as those guys, but again, I'm using him as an example to say that you can be hurt, you can suffer through injuries and still find a way to etch a role for yourself and be effective on the court when the coach puts you out there. And that's my biggest issue with Simmons is I thought there was a world where he could have been effective as a role player and as a Swiss Army knife guy, and he never truly tapped into that. That is my biggest gripe with Ben Simmons at this point in time. But again, I get it. Injuries can make you lose faith in the game and make you lose hunger. So I think that context is needed and that context is fully understood. But it's just really rough seeing him get to this point in his career after looking like one of the most promising players in the NBA in the late 2010s through the early 2020s. So we'll see what ends up happening with Simmons, and we'll see if a team does end up picking him up and signing him. Again, some teams throughout like the latter part in his 29-year-old career thought that he could end up playing that Swiss Army knife and utility player sort of role, and he never fully tapped into that and morphed into that. And maybe there's someone out there who still believes that is something he can do. So we'll see what ends up happening here with Simmons. Again, just a really rough go around for somebody who was so highly touted in the early part of his NBA career.